Good morning, all of you. Once again, a warm welcome to this sometimes cold hall. Today we have a very interesting session to start with in the morning, and perhaps this session would also remind us some of the very insightful thoughts which were given to us from yesterday's deliberations. For example, in the prayer which Naresh Kirti made starting the conference, which he quoted from the Bhriguvalli of Taittiriya Upanishad, there is an exclamation of this very happy seeker finally proclaiming that I am the food, I am also the eater of the food. Later, Professor Matsusawa in his lecture talked about a major difference between us and the chimpanzees. The chimpanzees live in the here and now, me and the world, and we also have me, the world, and the you, the triadic relation. I guess the major problem of the self and the other is also an exciting challenge for us to understand our complex ways of experiencing, our complex ways of relating with other people, and our complex inner worlds. And this morning's session is going to precisely do that, which is present some of these different worlds. And we start with Professor John P. John, MD. He's a professor of psychiatry and the head of the Department of Clinical Neurosciences at the National Institute of Mental Health and Neurosciences, which is a premier institute in Bangalore. He will speak on auditory hallucinations in schizophrenia, a window to the conscious self and its aberrations. Professor John.
Good morning, all of you. Let's start with some spooky stuff today morning. It's about hallucinations. I work at the National Institute of Mental Health and Neurosciences, as Dr. Sangeeta Menon said, as a consultant psychiatrist, and I also do some research on neuroimaging using multiple modalities of neuroimaging in patients with schizophrenia and dementia as well, along with a few other topics such as different cognitive states and meditative states and so on. So today I'm going to be talking to you about some of the work that we have been doing recently on looking at the neural correlates of auditory verbal hallucinations. I hope that most of you in this audience know what is auditory hallucinations. Auditory hallucinations, all of you know? Okay, if you don't know, let me just, okay, by the way, this is where we do our work, the image analysis work, and...
Come here, go on, do it.
Is it audible?
Go.
Not audible? Huh? Okay, so this is a little sample of auditory hallucinations that the patients with schizophrenia experience. So now let's look at, before I move on into my speech, because there are lots of differing definitions of consciousness, I probably would attempt to lay out some definitions which I would be using during the course of my talk. So as I mentioned, I would probably lay out some of the definitions of consciousness that I would be using during the course of this talk. So while we were listening to those voices, what was happening? We were attentive and we were aware of something that was happening in the external world. This is referred to as external awareness. We were also aware that we are the individuals who are experiencing those voices. So that is called the awareness of self. And the moment you heard those voices, you also had certain internal thoughts about voices. You were mentioning, is it real? Is it not real? Is there something in there? What is it about? What are they talking? What does that mean to me? So there is a certain amount of self conversations that would go on in your mind, and you are aware of even that. So that is referred to as a state of internal awareness. So consciousness is all of this. So consciousness is a quality of the state of awareness of self, or of being aware of an external object, which is referred to as an external awareness, or something within oneself, which is an internal awareness. So, as the saying goes, anything that we are aware of at any given moment forms part of our consciousness. So now, what about self? So what is self? A self is a person's essential being that distinguishes them from others. Especially, self is considered as the object of introspection or reflexive action. So beyond self, external awareness and internal awareness, there's something called as meta-awareness. Meta-awareness refers to being aware that one is self-aware. So thus we see that consciousness has four components. One is the external awareness, the second is self-awareness, third is internal awareness, and fourth is meta-awareness. So all of us know that we are not only aware, but we are also aware that we are aware. So this is what is referred to as meta-awareness. And if we look at the levels of consciousness, we can see that there is a pyramid which goes from unconsciousness, that is being non-responsive to the self and environment, to consciousness, which is focusing attention on the environment. Predominantly what is being usually referred to as consciousness is your ability to engage with the environment and to process incoming external stimuli. And then there is self-awareness, as we had discussed, and then there is meta-self-awareness. So in psychiatry, in psychiatric disorders like schizophrenia, what we are dealing with is not the bottom of the pyramid, but abnormalities in self-awareness and meta-self-awareness. We'll come to that subsequently. So there's something, okay. So when we are experiencing auditory hallucinations or any voices or anything in the environment, there are certain things that occur within our brains. So let's see what are these the brain correlates of an external perception. So to experience any percept, first of all, we need to be awake. I hope that all of you, despite all these skirmishes and goof-ups happening here, I hope all of you are still awake. So this is mediated by the ascending reticular activating system. And then I hope all of you are attentive to what's happening on that screen. So this is mediated by the attentional network and the executive network in the frontal lobes. And then you're seeing something on the screen, so your visual brain regions should also be activated. And then you understand that this is something very important to which I need to pay selective attention to as compared to whatever is happening around me, whatever bodily sensations I might be experiencing and so on. So that is referred to as the salience network. This network that mediates this is called the salience network, which involves the connections between the anterior insula and the anterior cingulate. And then we have whatever we are perceiving, we match up with whatever is already stored in our memory through the memory regions in the medial temporal lobe. And then, as I had mentioned earlier, we are also aware of all the thoughts or other experiences that we are experiencing internally as a result of the visual perception, and this is mediated by the internal awareness network on the medial side, on the sagittal side of the brain. And finally, we also are aware that it is we who are experiencing the percept and not any other. So this is referred to as the self-agency. So you can see that consciousness involves multiple brain regions working in unison, and of course, the finer details about the neural correlates of consciousness and how all of these brain regions work in unison to help us experience percept as a whole is not fully elucidated, but we know that there are these brain regions that work in unison. So now, what happens in schizophrenia is what the object of our research is. So how is consciousness affected in schizophrenia? As I had mentioned, patients with schizophrenia are overall conscious in the usual sense of the term, but then the abnormalities of consciousness in schizophrenia occurs at the self-awareness or the meta-awareness level. So before going further, I would probably, for those of you who are not familiar with schizophrenia, I'll explain what is schizophrenia in slight detail. Schizophrenia is a condition that is characterized by various kinds of symptoms referred to as positive symptoms, negative symptoms. Under positive symptoms you have delusions, hallucinations, which most of you would have probably heard about, and you also have disorders in the way they speak, or the way in which they act, or the way in which they express their emotions. And then there are negative symptoms characterized by withdrawal and not socializing with people and not motivated to do work and so on. And then you have cognitive deficits. They have deficits in the way their brain functions, in their ability to attend, the ability to memorize things, or the ability to do higher order executive functions. And then there are other symptoms as well, all of which leads to the social and occupational dysfunction significant social and occupational dysfunction that these patients with schizophrenia suffer from. Now, the concept of schizophrenia was described formally around the turn of the last century by Emil Kraepelin, who described it as dementia precox, that is, dementia occurring at an early age, and he described it as a disunity of consciousness, something like an orchestra without a conductor. Now, the term schizophrenia was introduced by Eugen Bleuler, who referred to schizophrenia as a condition characterized by splitting and dissociation of the whole personality. So there is a disintegration of the personality, and thus the personality forfeits its natural harmony. Now, Joseph Berzé, who is a contemporary of Emil Kraepelin and Eugen Bleuler, was the first person to describe schizophrenia as a basic alteration of self-consciousness. He referred to schizophrenia as a peculiar change, a diminished luminosity and affectability of self-awareness. So, as I had mentioned earlier, schizophrenia does not affect consciousness in the commonly used sense of the term. You see patients with schizophrenia, they are awake, they are walking around, they might look quite conscious to a person who is not aware that this individual is suffering from schizophrenia. However, as I had mentioned, it does affect self-awareness and meta-self-awareness, and patients with hallucinations and delusions have been known to have aberrant or deviant self-awareness, while those with negative symptoms who are not adequately interacting with the environment are referred to as having retarded self-awareness or meta-self-awareness. Now, coming to the subject matter of hallucinations, as all of you might know, is the awareness of a percept. It might be a visual percept, it might be an auditory percept, it might be a tactile sensation on your skin, or anything. An awareness of a percept in the absence of a real stimulus. For example, a person listens to some people conversing, discussing, even when there is no one in the environment who is responsible for that stimulus. So, voices constitute the most common type of hallucinations in schizophrenia. Patients with schizophrenia complain about voices. They are able to hear voices. So, therefore, auditory hallucinations are a good model to study the neural correlates of aberrant conscious awareness of a percept. As I had mentioned earlier, there are certain brain regions that are usually involved in the awareness of a percept. So, if we study the neural correlates of hallucinations, wherein there is no real stimulus which causes the percept, we might be able to delineate which brain regions are overactive, which brain regions are active when they are not supposed to be, which could underlie the experience of auditory hallucinations. And in turn, it could also help us further our understanding of the neural basis of disorders of self-agency or the self-disorder. As I had mentioned, self-agency is responsible for our self-awareness, that we are the persons who are experiencing the percept and no other. I will not even attempt to play out the auditory hallucinations here. So just to say that there have been various studies looking at the functional imaging correlates of auditory verbal hallucinations. They can be broadly divided into trait studies and state studies. Trait studies means people who are having schizophrenia who have the experience of auditory hallucinations are suggested to have certain brain abnormalities, and irrespective of whether they are experiencing hallucinations or not, at the time of imaging, the studies would attempt to find certain brain abnormalities in such individuals. State studies refers to fMRI studies conducted during the hallucinatory episode. So these are referred to as capture studies, and therefore they directly measure brain activation associated with the onset of hallucinations. Now, this is a review of some of the findings of existing studies. They have shown that there are regions like the left inferior parietal lobule, left hippocampus, parahippocampal regions, left superior temporal gyrus, globus pallidus, Broca's convolution, and so on, right anterior insula, and so on, which are overactive in these individuals with schizophrenia. But there are certain problems with existing studies in schizophrenia. Most of these studies, as I had mentioned, are trait studies. They have not attempted to capture the brain activity during the experience of auditory hallucinations. Many of these studies have also looked at what happens in these individuals with hallucinations during the resting state, and they are just resting. But there is no way for us to ascertain whether in that resting state during the fMRI study they were indeed experiencing hallucinations. So we have tried to develop a paradigm wherein we are trying to capture the brain's function during the experience of auditory hallucinations, and to the best of our knowledge, except for a couple of studies who have required the subjects to press a button in the fMRI scanner while they are experiencing auditory hallucinations, so squeeze a rubber ball which is connected to the system while they are experiencing auditory hallucinations. Again, we have, it's quite unpredictable in its acquisition, and there is no objective way of quantifying whether the patients indeed were experiencing auditory hallucinations. So, to the best of our knowledge, this is one of the initial attempts to develop a paradigm to capture the brain correlates of the auditory hallucinatory experience inside the fMRI gantry. So this task we have referred to as attentional modulational task. It comprises of three conditions. The first condition is called the free attention condition, wherein the subject is asked to keep his eyes on the center of the screen and not pay attention to anything in particular, while an abstract monochromatic figure changes in the center of the screen. At the end of this task, the subject is asked to press any button of their choice. There are certain response buttons inside the scanner. The next is referred to as a visual attention condition, wherein we attempt to take the attention away from of the patient with auditory hallucinations from their auditory hallucinations, so that they are engaged in a visual attention task. Again, they are asked to keep the eyes on the center and count the number of times the pattern on the screen changes. So, how many times has the pattern changed? 3. Including the first one, it's 4, so the pattern has changed 3 times. The patients would be trained prior to the fMRI task. So, and then the third condition is a hallucination attention condition, which is administered only in patients with schizophrenia. Healthy subjects obviously do not have the auditory hallucinations, and the same the images flash on the screen, and the patients are instructed to focus on the hallucinations and not to focus on anything else. And at the end of the particular block, they have to press another button indicating whether they have listened to experience a hallucination at least 50% of time during the previous block. And only those patients who have experienced hallucinations during the course of the fMRI acquisition would be taken up for further analysis. And of course, they would be compared with those individuals who have not experienced the hallucinations during the fMRI acquisition. And these are the image acquisition parameters. I will not go into it, go into details. It was acquired on a 3 Tesla scanner, and this is a description of a typical subject with schizophrenia. This is one of our 7 subjects with schizophrenia. Was a 22-year-old male with a history of 10 months of illness, characterized by second and third person auditory hallucinations. Second person auditory hallucinations refers to voices talking directly to them, and third person auditory hallucinations refers to voices conversing and referring to the individual in third person. And he also had elements of running commentary, some voice giving a running commentary of all his actions, like how you listen to a running commentary of a cricket match or a football match. and he also had persecutory delusions and thought broadcasts. He was diagnosed as having paranoid schizophrenia, and he was not on medications at the time of acquisition. These are the brain regions that we have considered to study the connectivity of the different brain regions during the experience of hallucinations. These brain regions have been taken from previous studies of the neural correlates of perception, as well as all the previous studies that have suggested certain brain regions to be affected during, in people with auditory hallucinations. This is the pipeline of analysis. My PhD scholar Pravesh, who is here, who is a Niaz Mani Bhaumik awardee, who's been largely instrumental in carrying out this analysis. fMRI time series undergoes a series of pre-processing steps, and the time series from each ROI, that is region of interest, is extracted, and there is a correlation between multiple regions of interest is calculated, and then it is Fisher transformed, and a one sample t-test was conducted to find which are the significant connections, and then maps are generated based on the t-statistic, that is the connections which are significant, and also based on the extent of correlations between the different brain regions. Now let's look at the results reasonably quickly. So these are the brain connections of healthy subjects during the free attention condition. So these are the frontal regions, these are the insula, this is the superior temporal gyrus, which is the auditory cortex, these are the memory regions, and these are the regions, the parietal regions involved in self-awareness and self-agency, and these are the visual regions. I will mark it again for you. So the frontal regions are referred to as the central executive network and salience network. Frontoparietal connections are involved in attention. The visual network is involved in visual perception. The medial temporal structure is involved in memory. And the medial structures, the anterior cingulate, medial prefrontal cortex, thalamus, and the medial parietal lobe, they are all involved in self-awareness. And so you can see that the major brain regions that are involved in attention and perception, because there are, this is the free attention condition, those visual images are flashed across the screen, the subjects are perceiving the stimuli on the screen, so they are, all the brain regions that are involved in visual perception, that is the frontal network, the frontoparietal network, the visual network, and the memory regions, as I had mentioned earlier, and the internal awareness regions, they are all activated. Now, what happens in patients with schizophrenia? As you can see, as compared to the previous slide, I will of course show you a comparator slide later, the connections, overall connections between these brain regions are a little sparser. And the major connections are there, the frontal connections, you can see that, these red regions are regions that have multiple connections with, red nodes are nodes which have multiple connections with the neighboring and distant nodes. So all the major regions, including the prefrontal cortex, the insula, the internal awareness, the thalamus, and the precuneus are all activated along with the visual regions. But what is shown here is that patients with schizophrenia, during the free attention condition, they have an excessive connection between the superior parietal lobes on the left and right regions. Is that 10 minutes warning? I'm almost completing. I'm almost done. Sorry. Yeah. Is it a hallucination? Yeah. Or maybe. Yeah. All right. So this is the one difference that you see even in the free attention condition. So now, comparing the healthy and schizophrenia subjects, you can see that schizophrenia subjects had more sparser connections. So their connections are probably not as strong as the connections in healthy subjects during the experience, during the perception of a visual stimulus. And all the major regions are activated in healthy subjects, as you can see, the prefrontal, all of this. And in schizophrenia subjects, even though there are sparser connections, there is one connection between this node and this node, which is a superior parietal lobe. There are two lines here. The one line is between the precuneus on both sides, which is important for internal awareness, and this connections are stronger in patients with schizophrenia. Now let's look at what happens during the visual attention condition. During this condition, as I had mentioned earlier, the subjects are engaged in the visual task and trying to see with focused attention how many times the pattern changes. As you have seen, it's not very easy, so they have to give a lot of attention to this task. So during that condition, in healthy subjects, as you can see, the visual regions are quite active. Again, there is connection between precuneus, but not between these two nodes, and the frontal connections and the medial connections are, as usual, activated. What happens in patients with schizophrenia? You can see that the visual connections are not as strong, even though there are these brain regions. These are visual regions, these are activated. But again, the connection that you see two lines. One line is the precuneus, which is the internal awareness, and the other is the left superior parietal lobule on both sides, which are hyperconnected. Again, to compare this, the visual attention connectivity map between patients with schizophrenia and healthy subjects, what stands out is the connection between the superior parietal lobule on both sides. As I'll come back to superior parietal lobule later, but we had seen that superior parietal lobule is perhaps one of the most important structures of underlying self-agency. That is, I am the person who is experiencing this, I am the person who is responsible for my perception and not somebody else. I will skip this. This is just a comparison between the free attention and visual attention in healthy and schizophrenia subjects. As you've already seen, again, this is the one connection which differentiates between healthy and patients with schizophrenia. So this is the hallucination attention condition in all the 7 subjects with schizophrenia. So this is a condition wherein they are asked to focus on the hallucination. And as you can see here, again, the superior parietal connections are pretty strong, and then there is a strong connection between the superior parietal lobule and the inferior parietal lobule, and the left superior temporal gyrus, which is the auditory cortex, which is involved in auditory perception, is red now here. That means that it is showing lots of connections with neighboring nodes. And you can see that there is an asymmetry between the left and the right superior temporal gyrus. The left superior temporal gyrus is involved in auditory perception, of auditory verbal perception. So you can see that during the hallucination attention condition, there are further changes. So this is again, just to highlight what is the difference between in patients with schizophrenia during the free attention condition, the visual attention condition, and the hallucination attention condition. You can see that in the visual attention condition, there is no asymmetry in the connections of the superior temporal gyrus, whereas in hallucination attention condition, there is indeed a difference. So I have 5 more minutes. Okay. So we have, amongst the 7 patients with schizophrenia, we've had 4 people who were hallucinators who reported that, they experienced hallucinations during the course of the fMRI acquisition, and 3 who reported not experiencing hallucinations. So we try to look at a preliminary difference between these individuals. As you can see here, the hallucinators, you see a tight connection between the superior parietal lobules connecting to the inferior parietal lobule, and strong connection in the left superior temporal gyrus of the auditory cortex. Whereas in the non-hallucinators, this connection is between the precuneus. This is not the superior parietal lobule, as you can see here, and there are no increased activations in the left superior temporal gyrus. So this is by no means a confirmatory finding. This is a sort of a descriptive finding on the neural correlates of auditory hallucinations. We have just initiated work on confirming this initial hypothesis on a larger sample of patients with schizophrenia having persistent auditory hallucinations. However, I think some of the consistent results across multiple cognitive states give us a lot of hope that perhaps this is a good paradigm to look at the neural correlates of auditory hallucinations. So therefore, I have put together some of the networks that are involved in the normal visual perception, as you have seen, the central executive network, the frontoparietal network, which is involved in the external awareness, insular salience network, which is involved in selective attention, internal awareness, then the thalamic filter, memory regions, self-agency, which is important, and the visual network for the visual perception. And what happens in schizophrenia potentially could be there is an increase in the connection in the superior parietal lobule, which is an aberrant connection, which leads on to auditory perception in superior temporal gyrus. I will not go into details of that. So there have been previous studies that have reported using different methods that superior parietal lobule could be one of the most crucial brain regions in evaluating self-generated movements and the role of the superior parietal lobule in self-agency. This is a typical corollary discharge mechanism that is suggested for as a neurophysiological model of self-agency. Whenever the brain gives a command to the body, a particular part of the body to move, an efference copy of that same command is sent as part of a forward model, and then the action takes place in a part of the body, and then there is a real sensory consequence of that action, and then this is compared with a predicted sensory consequence based on the efference copy, and then if the predicted sensory feedback and the real sensory feedback matches, then it is considered as generated by self. If there is a mismatch, then it is considered as generated by other. This is referred to as the corollary discharge mechanism, and perhaps the superior parietal lobule could be an important seat of the corollary discharge mechanism as suggested by Feinberg and Frith. If you just have to replace movement with a thought as an action, and a similar reference copy could be sent, and then there is a comparison which occurs in the superior parietal lobule when there is a mismatch due to aberrant hyperconnectivity, as you have seen in patients with schizophrenia. There could be a mismatch, and that the perception could be considered as generated by an individual outside of his own self. So the aberrant hyperconnectivity, therefore, of the bilateral superior parietal lobule could be strongly associated with the experience of auditory hallucinations. We have already shown previously that there could be aberrant activations. It's not all hypoactivations in patients with schizophrenia. There could be aberrant activations and deficient deactivations of the brain during cognitive task performance in schizophrenia. These are the last couple of slides. So this could have neurochemical basis, as explained by the glutamatergic abnormalities, hyperglutamatergia caused by NMDA receptor. NMDA receptor is the major receptor for glutamatergic transmission, and NMDA receptor hypofunction leading on to a hyperglutamatergic state in the brain, which could potentially lead on to the hyperconnectivity in certain parts of the brain. In our case, in patients with auditory hallucinations, could be in the superior parietal lobule. So therefore, to connect all of this, there could be a primary NMDA receptor hypofunction in patients with schizophrenia at certain crucial locations in the brain. We understand that it is in the GABAergic interneurons that are located either in the prefrontal cortex or in the subcortical structures, and this could cause a net cortical excitation, and which could lead on to an increased parieto-temporal activations during the course of experience of the auditory verbal hallucinations. So what are the implications of this for understanding neural correlates of conscious awareness? So the findings that we have underline the importance of self-agency in higher forms of consciousness, that is self and meta-awareness, as I had mentioned earlier, and superior parietal lobule could be a possible substrate of self-agency, and this is in keeping with, supporting the evidence generated from previous studies, and we propose potentially that, this particular brain region, aberrant hyperconnectivity of this particular brain region could be underlying the experience of auditory verbal hallucinations. I thank all my lab mates, especially Pravesh and Harsha, for work on this project, and all my collaborators and funding agencies for kindly funding my work. Thank you so much for your kind attention.
Sir John, and I'm sure there would be questions and comments which we would take up in the open session.